So, thank you everyone for joining us for the first event in our Regenerating Our World series, exploring the transition to a just, sustainable future. This series is a collaboration between RSA Oceania, the Sustainability Network, and IdeaSpies, an open innovation network to share ideas and original thinking. And today we'll be exploring why climate policy has become a political flashpoint in nations around the world, with politicians and vested interests fueling divisive debates that undermine climate action. And we'll also hear about some examples where democratic innovation is supporting regenerative transformation. And to explore this topic, we're extremely fortunate to be joined by our panel, Jane Davidson, Tom Hardy, and Dr. Nivek Thompson. Jane is the chair of Wales Net Zero 2035 and the author of Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country, the story of how Wales became the first country in the world to legislate in the interest of future generations. From 2000 to 2011, she was the Cabinet Minister for Education, then Environment and Sustainability in Wales, where she proposed legislation to make sustainability the central organising principle of government through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act. She is also the Pro-Vice Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. Tom Hardy is a former government education advisor and environmentalist. He is the co-founder of MP Watch, a constituency network monitoring climate denial in Parliament and MPs' commitment to net zero. He is also a member of Extinction Rebellion and often writes about risks posed by misinformation and disinformation. Dr. Nivek Thompson is the founder and director of a boutique consultancy, Deliberately Engaging, which provides services to government and non-government organizations, primarily in design and recruitment of participants for deliberative engagement processes. Nivek recently completed her PhD on whether democratic innovations could improve democracy. And she is also the host and producer of the Real Democracy Now! Podcast and the producer of the Facilitating Public Deliberations podcast. Welcome to you all. And just to give you an idea of how we're going to structure today's event, first of all, we're going to have a brief discussion with our panelists where they're going to answer a few preliminary questions, and then we're going to bring in questions from the audience. And to begin with, I'm going to ask all of you to respond to an initial question, which is that this event series is called Regenerating Our World. And part of that, of course, is ensuring that the long-term well-being of people and the planet is at the heart of government decision-making. So what do you think needs to shift to enable that focus? And what are the dynamics at play that are preventing it? And I'm going to start, I think, with Tom.
Hi, well, very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I have, having been invited, I wrote reams and reams of bullet points. So I'm really going to have to cut them down. Just to give you my headline points, I think first and foremost, and obviously what I'm going to say is UK centric. So in Q&As, you can ask me to unpack or explain things. But first and foremost, I think in the UK, we need to retrieve our democracy, hopefully to include citizens' assemblies and upgrades as soon as possible. But what we've seen here is over the last government, 14 years, we've sleepwalked into a corporatocracy with a little bit of kleptocracy thrown in with PPI, fast track processes, but we won't talk about that now. It's sobering that Civicus, the organization promoting civil society, has now downgraded democracy in the UK to the same ranking as Hungary, and we are going in the wrong direction, or have done over the last 14 years. At the heart of the problems of the cancer in our society, I would suggest that all roads lead to Tufton Street. Tufton Street, for those of you who don't know, it's a small very nice street of Georgian houses, very near the Houses of Parliament. And it is the home of about 13 neoliberal free market think tanks. But they have kept their funding very secretive. But over time, various different investigative reports have revealed that they're all funded. All funding can all be traced back to the Koch brothers oil company in the States. And with that funding, they've bought their way into government to become the puppet masters of policy, pulling the strings on behalf of big oil. And they still try and keep that quiet, but really that's all now in the public domain. And just to give you an idea of a few of the names, which may come up later, they're all climate denying. And they won't say they're deniers now. They'll say that they're delayers. They're just adding to the debate. But basically, they've all come from an absolutist climate denying background. So primary amongst these is the Global Warming Policy Foundation. But amongst them, just high-profile ones, there's the Policy Exchange, the Center for Policy Studies, the Taxpayers Alliance, and a dozen more maybe. And their trick is that they're all the same organization with different names. So they put different hats on for different audiences. This was all revealed by whistleblower Shamir Sani, who revealed that they meet every Saturday with the Telegraph and the right-wing press in order to strategize how they're going to get in the way of climate policy. And also, I might have time to go into how they are affecting the law in this country in order to stop protest and all of that kind of thing, which has been authoritarian, to put it bluntly. Now, this is the last 14 years. I'm hoping, I'm sure we're all hoping, that they are going to be shown the door by the new Labour administration. But unfortunately, already we've seen Graham Stringer, MP, who is Labour, and he is a member of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, completely counterintuitively. The government have already met with Drax, who are a polluting power industry. And worryingly, Lord O'Donoghue, former chairman of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, has donated £10,000 to Rachel Reeves. So we haven't got off to a good start. So my other bullet points, which I won't go into at length because I don't want to take up other people's time. But secondly, we need the law and the media once again in this country to function as independent pillars of democracy rather than agents of the state. 6 months ago, while still in his job, Robert Jenrick said ominously, "The law is our servant, not our master," brazenly threatening the process of judicial review, holding the government to account. And the government has, in their frustration at being held back at every point, suggested leaving the ECHR. They've used what are called Henry VIII protocols to allow ministers to bring into law bypassing Parliament. All of this is extraordinarily medieval. I think we need to address the issue of regulatory capture. All the regulatory bodies now have enforcers from the Tory government within their ranks in order to make sure that there is no pushback against government policy. Again, that's over 14 years. And my final point is that we need to move beyond political short-termism. What we need to be looking at is, getting away from the idea of just working towards electoral success to looking to the long term, because that's the only way that we will have the systemic change essential for rapid decarbonation and establishing a degrowth economy And of course, that brings us back to citizens' assemblies, which I'm sure we'll hear about later. Okay, I'll stop there. I could go on.
Thank you so much, Tom. So much we can pick up on, but a perfect segue to pass over to Jane, who, of course, is the architect of one of the most long-term policies that I can think of.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning from Wales and good evening from Australia. So, really delighted to be invited to join this call. Yes, there's so much I'd want to debate with Tom, because he said some incredibly important things actually about what's going on in the dark rooms that are trying to stop good action everywhere in the world. And I'm just going to carry on with my sort of stubborn optimism, though, which is that I do hope that partly the sort of democratic outcome that Tom refers to in terms of the election is actually a kind of wholesale rejection of a lot of that. But he will have to still keep a very strong eye on the incoming government in terms of the issues. But I think that there are models that are of extraordinary interest here, which is, how we reframe the debate. I mean, I didn't know that I would end up in a position where I'd be sitting on a call like this and doing 4 events a week somewhere in the world and engaging with 30 countries over the idea of turning short-term decisions into long-term decisions, because I didn't know that was not happening everywhere. So I'm kind of like, I'm just telling in a couple of minutes a very short story of a big ambition that I would love if more countries took up, particularly before the UN Summit for the Future, which is taking place in September, which is partly why there's a lot of interest. But essentially, I know there's quite a few people on the call so I know that there are a lot of people who've heard me say this already. So in short, Wales has a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, of which I was proud to play a significant part. And what we were trying to do in creating that was actually tackle this issue about short-termism by rethinking the values that needed to underpin everything we do. So if you'll allow me to call that an upstream approach to policy and lawmaking, whereas normally what happens is we use downstream approaches, which is, if something happens like a major flood, and we need more money to deal with it, and we need some more instant action, it's not about changing the law, it's actually about regulating further down the line. And obviously these are kind of patch approaches. They're like elastoplasts on delivery. And what we tried to do was, not least as a relatively new administration, having only been created since 1999, was to say, what are the values of the people of Wales? How can we develop a framework that actually delivers on those values? So in short, we now have a piece of legislation that reflects the UN SDGs, because it's important to think in a global frame, has 5 ways of working, having to think preventatively, having to think long term, having to collaborate, having to integrate outcomes, and having to involve people about whom decisions are being made. And that last is really hard. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Nivek has to say about alternative kinds of democracy. And then 7 goals absolutely linked to those UN SDGs. And the really important part of this is the content of the goals, which include living within planetary boundaries, acting on climate, being globally responsible, looking at the causes of ill health, looking at the causes of issues in society, rather than always looking at that sticking plaster approach. So I think the most important message I have at this stage is, if we reframe the debate, and I've written about this in an article about courageous governance for the RSA that was published a month ago, we have to engage with the values that we want our systems to promote, and then we could put those values up there for consideration. And I think what's been really interesting in the story of Wales is that although we are really bad at involving people about whom decisions are being made, it has led to huge changes in the short time that this Act has been in place, which has been since 2016. And if you look at the kind of government decisions that are made in Wales, 20 miles an hour, because of the fact that that tackled air pollution, that reduced the risks of accident, that made our communities safer, for example. There's a much bigger look at co-benefits in the context of how we achieve the outcomes. And I think I'll just finish at this point in saying that the key things that mattered in the architecture of the Act was to create legislation that held the government to account. Governments don't normally get held to account. They normally hold others to account. But the government has to be held to account if you're doing something countercultural. So we put in the idea that the government would be accountable, which it already is, to the National Audit Office in Wales, but that this accountability meant the National Audit Office had to change the way they audited. So they now have to, and are in the process of changing the way they audit both the government and all the government's public sector organisations. It had to link to a global agenda, hence linking to the SDGs. It had to have, as part of that accountability, a mechanism that was regulated for. Now, that could be citizens' assemblies or standing juries, but in our case, we chose a commissioner. So there's an independent commissioner that holds all the public services and the government to account. And it is overseen as well by Parliament. So there's a number of mechanisms whereby the Act is continually in people's minds, which has enabled this very much to be the permission to think and act differently. And I think that what it generates, which is really, really exciting, is massive support from many of those public servants who want to see a more sustainable Wales, who want to see a fairer Wales. And I won't pick up on this now, but it has definitely led to the role that I now have as chair of Wales Net Zero 2035, which is how can a government committed to future generations accelerate action on climate in a fair, just, sustainable and nature positive way? Thank you. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Philippa.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I'll now pass over to Nivek to get her initial thoughts.
Thanks so much. I totally agree with Tom. Democracy is increasingly at risk around the world. And it's not just the United Kingdom that's having their democratic rankings downgraded, but other, fairly long established Western democracies are facing similar things. My background is looking at democratic innovations, and they're seen by many as a way to engage citizens in decision making, and they are making some difference around the world. I think the question for us in terms of climate is, are they achieving enough? And, do they contribute to democracy? My PhD research, which I'll talk about a little bit more about later, was looking at whether deliberative mini publics could, contribute to the quality of democracy. And I concluded that they can and do. However, they could do a lot more. So there's citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies being held around the world at national, regional and local levels to provide citizen input into climate change mitigation decisions. And I think a lot of the people from the UK, will be aware of the UK Climate Assembly, the French Climate Assembly. I can't speak French, so I can't give you the proper name. And, there has even been some work at an international level around climate, global warming and so on. I guess the key challenge with these processes is the relationship between the processes and the decision makers. And there's two aspects to that. And the first one is, what are they asked to respond to? What is the question they're being asked to respond to? And that question can be quite narrow, or it can be, like it's not a question of whether it's narrow or broad, one's better than the other. It's really, does the question actually allow them to delve into issues and come up with recommendations that will make a difference and that are important to them? And the second aspect of the relationship with decision makers relates to whether or not decision makers actually do anything with the recommendations that come from them. Are they really running these processes simply as window dressing, or do the processes have a real impact on policy and program change? And I know, I haven't studied the French and the UK climate assemblies in a lot of detail, but I know that the answer to that would probably be yes and no in terms of the impact they've had. And that's, one of the, some of the big challenges. People like citizens' juries because the process engages everyday people who often aren't engaged. They're much more reflective of the demographics of a community than, traditional processes. But I guess that's where my research said they do a reasonable job, but they could do a lot more. And that is if we actually start looking at, in more detail, the relationship with decision makers. And I know in Australia that a lot of the citizens' juries that have been held both on climate change and other things, there's been very little research about what happened afterwards. There's a lot of fanfare about the process, a lot of public attention to the recommendations being provided to the decision makers, but you don't really know what happened after very much. So, that's the challenge, in my view.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Navag. I'm just going to pick up on a few things and then we'll start the Q&A with the audience. So in the meantime, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. But firstly, Tom, I just wanted to pick up on what you said around lies and disinformation, because this, of course, is your area of speciality. So as you were saying, lies and disinformation have dominated much of the election campaigns we've seen, especially this year, and the upcoming election, particularly in the US and other places. So what effect is this having not only on our democratic institutions, but also public engagement around climate action?
Well, knowing this question would come up, the first thing I jotted down was this quote from German philosopher Hannah Arendt, talking about the disinformation of her time, and she quotes, "This constant lying is not aimed at making the people believe a lie, but in ensuring that no one believes anything anymore. A people that can no longer distinguish between truth and lies cannot distinguish between right and wrong. And such a people, deprived of the power to think and judge, is without knowing and willing it, completely subjected to the rule of lies. With such a people, you can do whatever you want." And what we've seen in this country is such brazen lying in the press, obviously in any part of the political realm, that I'm sure that that's part of their playbook. Now, the Tufton Street think tanks might not have as much control embedded in government as they used to do, but they're still deeply rooted in the press, spreading disinformation about the science, undermining the scientific establishment, and to protect, obviously, their fossil fuel funders' interests. I did write at length about the tropes of denial in the RSA magazine, so I don't have time to unpack that here. But top of the list is cherry picking, and I think I wrote somewhere, I think Byline Times, I wrote an article that just unpicked or just went into detail of one of my complaints to the regulator about how an op-ed piece invited by the Telegraph by one of Tufton Street's spokespeople is completely wrong. He knows it's wrong, but he still lies on top of the lies. What we've also seen, though, in the political realm is from the press is an absolute ramping up of the incitement of violence towards climate activists, again stoked by commissioned editorials in the right-wing press by mostly members of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And I'll just give one stark example. So Charles Moore, senior fellow at the Policy Exchange, at Tufton Street's Policy Exchange, praised a recent report commissioned by the last government to try and demonize climate activists as extremists, and even, equating us with terrorists. And he wrote a glowing article about this in the Telegraph. And soon after that, Gail Bradbrook, who is the founder of XR, received a message on her social media saying, "People like you should be shot in the face. Your kids should witness it and then also be shot in the face. You are absolute scum." And that's the tenor of conversation that we're seeing increasingly. Now, I think it's pretty ironic and perhaps deliberate that the government has removed the crime of incitement from the Serious Crime Act, which could have outlawed articles like this, while the new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which was written by the Policy Exchange and imposed on the government, we had a client government. So the laws were basically written by Tufton Street. And so incitement only applies now to inciting people to join a peaceful protest. The press have free rein. And it's interesting that there are two press regulators, and newspapers can choose between them. And one has protocols against incitement to violence, and the other one doesn't. Guess which one the right-wing press have decided to sign up to? Obviously the one that doesn't. I don't know how long I have, but the broadcast media are also in the frame for this. The regulator, Ofcom of broadcast media, again with enforcers within its ranks, lets broadcasters get away with overt propaganda. We have something called GB News in this country, which basically has been funded by Tufton Street, and they are a disinformation body. But also the BBC. I'll just end with this. With the BBC now, who also have an enforcer called Robbie Gibb from the last government, who spikes out any feature that they cannot bring what they call a flat earther. They invite flat earthers in to rebut the science. But it's not so much now what is reported as what isn't. Now, there was a huge Restore Nature march in London. It was absolutely huge. It was 10,000 people. It's the biggest nature march there was. Loads of reporters there from different outlets. The BBC had a reporter there, Alex Forster, who I spoke to, and I spoke to afterwards, and was told, he told me that his editors had spiked the story due to a particularly busy day in sport. And I looked afterwards what was on the BBC site that they posted instead of the record-breaking climate and nature march was puppies given oxygen masks, a new record declared in nettle eating, and should live football disrupt news bulletins. That was more important than the climate nature march. I'll stop there. I'm taking up too much time.
Thank you, Tom. Golly, that's yeah, incredible. I'm just going to quickly ask Jane a question, and then there are actually heaps of questions for Nivek, so I'll jump straight to those afterwards. But Jane, I just wanted to pick up on your current role, which you mentioned previously, which is as chair of the Wales Net Zero 2035 Challenge Group. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that role and your work with the group, and also a bit about the findings of the group to date.
Thanks, Philippa. Yes, I mean, I think what's interesting about my role is that I don't think this could have happened without the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, because a lot of governments and parliaments have declared climate emergencies, and in fact, Wales, I think, was first at both. However, actually, if you then look at the statutory committee that monitors all the countries in the UK in terms of achieving outcomes, Wales was only due to achieve outcomes by 2055. And therefore, this was particularly important with a government and a parliament that was committed to future generations. So the Welsh government, which is Labour, and only holds half the seats in the Senedd, which is the Welsh name for our parliament, got together with Plaid Cymru, one of the opposition parties, and together they had a cooperation agreement. And one of the propositions in the cooperation agreement was to actually do this, is how quickly could Wales achieve pathways to 2035. And I think I was probably asked to undertake it because I had been previously, when I was a politician, which is back in 2011, worked very happily in a coalition government between Labour and Plaid Cymru. So I was very happy to accept this proposition to actually really test, not about targets, but about pathways, because most of the arguments in the climate sphere are about, can we achieve 1.5? Is it at risk? Can it still be achieved? Those sorts of things. Whereas actually, when I looked across the world for who is doing work on how quickly and fairly and in a nature positive way they can achieve outcomes, I'm actually terrified by how few countries are even looking at that sort of approach at all. So I've collected together, because I've given total independence, which I demanded out of this process, because I didn't want to be a government group that then got stopped at any point. Total independence to actually look at how we would achieve that. And the way that we've done it, and I'll put the link to Wales Net Zero 2035 in the chat at the end of my contribution now. The way we've done it is according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So we are obviously, if we look at climate issues, acting long term, we're thinking preventatively, we're integrating the outcomes, so we're always looking for co-benefits. We are collaborating very widely, so we've taken external evidence on the 4 big emission reduction areas in terms of food, transport, energy and buildings, but also on what are the risks, what are the enablers. And in fact, in terms of your role, Philippa, I mean, people, there are experts in Australia working with the Club of Rome who've done amazing work on risk and resilience that is now incorporated into our report, for example. So we've offered the opportunity for people to contribute internationally. Half the group is deliberately from Wales, half the group is outside, recognised experts in all of their spheres, and they have been charged with the responsibility of both having external evidence coming in, but also convening engagement with stakeholders in Wales so that people are involved in those decisions. And we are publishing. Oh, sorry, and there's a big strand also about what is education, skills, and the future of work, because that's the big answer to all of this, particularly in the context of a just transition, which is how we change what current jobs are into future jobs, how we make sure that our children are educated all the way through statutory school systems, colleges, and higher education. So we have these this really positive strand around education, skills and the future of work, alongside a really positive strand about what are the enablers to make this happen. And our fundamental proposition, using the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act processes, because going back to Nivek's point, processes, in my view now, are much more important than the what. The how is much more important than the what, because governments do what all the time. They say, we're going to do X, we're going to do Y, and they don't necessarily have an evidence base, and they haven't undertaken processes that give anybody necessarily confidence in how they reach their decisions. So for me, the fundamental work that we're doing is a what are the pathways, but how we get to those pathways is probably more important. So the fact that we're taking external evidence, the fact that we're involving stakeholders, the fact that we have all the key organizations as observers on our group and continually looking for expert advice on what we're doing, the fact that we have a set of expert readers across the world, and the fact that we're involving people about whom decisions are being made in our engagement practices is absolutely critical in terms of what we're going to publish, which will be on September the 11th. So we hope that actually what we do will be really useful. And the final element of this is actually it is underpinned by the most up-to-date academic evidence. So we got the Welsh Government to pay the independent Wales Centre for Public Policy based in Cardiff University, which is a very well-respected ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council Impact Centre, to look across the world for the best examples of the ways we could move forward. And that work is all available now, and I'll put that in the chat as well, because I think one of the ways in which we have to continually challenge Tom's really, really important points is by use of strong evidence and decisions made on strong evidence. And for me, that's the way I've conducted my whole political and policy life. And I hope that actually, that way in which we do our work can achieve greater recognition elsewhere. And I'm really hoping that our pathways, just like the Act, although they might be about Wales, they're also a signal about how you can develop the kind of governance to think differently and the consequences of having governance to think differently. And somebody's raised the question of Wales's 20-mile-an-hour limit. There was a lot of research done on that before it was introduced. Then there was a very tough and straight-headed response to Wales' 20 miles an hour. But I'm trying to find the article, but there's been a tremendous article in the last week or so, which has demonstrated the number of deaths that it has saved, the number of accidents that it has prevented. And the review is indicating so far that there will be very few changes. There will be no notion that our 20 miles an hour in all residential areas will be changed. There will be some changes on the main roads to make sure that there isn't a sort of kind of stop-start in going in and out of 20 miles an hour in areas that don't need it. But actually the 20 mile an hour will be here to stay. And that's because it's good for a whole range of reasons. And we're not the first to do it. When I travel through Europe, I find it all the time. So it's a question of what are the things that can benefit most of us more. And I still sit with an enormous amount of hope that the kind of things that we'll be proposing both will act on the climate and nature challenges, but we're only proposing the things that will also be hugely beneficial to the lives of the people of Wales.
Nivek, there are heaps of questions coming through on the chat, particularly around the funding around citizens' assemblies, which I can see you've partially responded to in the comments. But Lewis asks a really interesting question around how much leeway do citizen juries have in coming up with the proposals, or what is that relationship between, the government, how much control does the government have versus how much control citizens have in shaping that proposal?
Yeah, look, it really depends, but I think in a lot of cases, particularly of climate assemblies, governments are commissioning them, and there are academics running some, and there are some community, sort of advocacy organisations running them, but it's not as many. One of the things that I looked at in my research was how to, what should I use? What sort of criteria should I use to judge whether or not mini publics, citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries could contribute to the quality of democracy? And I found that when I was looking around at different models or theoretical approaches to the quality of democracy, they tended to focus on a particular form of democracy: representative democracy, direct democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, which is obviously the main one for citizens' assemblies and so on. I adopted a different approach, which is called democratic functions, which allows, which identifies a range of functions that a system needs to, have to actually be considered democratic. And the good thing about it is that it allows you to compare across institutions. So you could compare an electoral system with a system of deliberative mini-publics, that sort of thing. One of the democratic functions is collective agenda setting. And what I found when I looked at about 8 or 10 citizens' assemblies in Australia that weren't, specifically to do with climate, was that that they were weak in collective agenda setting. So the citizens had very little say in what was the agenda that they were asked to respond to. In a lot of places we call it the remit. And I recommended that we could actually set up a system whereby people, did have a say in the remit. Certainly in Belgian, they have a mini-public that sort of is an overarching body that sets the remit for other citizens' juries to make decisions and recommendations to government. So that's one way of doing it. There's any number of designs that you could come up with to actually achieve that. But at the moment, it's very rare. And people who are funding it, they want the answer to the question that they've put forward. They don't want something else. They don't want to let people do something else. So, it's a real challenge to get people to move beyond that. And facilitators, often have to say to people, well, I'm sorry, but that's, we'll make a note of that, but that's not what you were asked to do. I recruited a citizens' assembly for water futures. So the issue of water futures in a growth area in outer Melbourne in Victoria. And some people came along to observe, and they said, why are we accepting population growth? Like, the whole thing was premised on population growth in the area. And they were saying, why are we accepting that as a given? And the Citizens' Assembly were accepting that as a given because that was what they were asked to do. So they didn't have a choice. So yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge, but it's something that's very important if you want these sort of processes to really truly contribute to democracy.
Thank you, Nivek. I want to pick up on another question actually that Lynn has just asked that I also have myself, which is what happens to global climate policies if Donald Trump is re-elected in November? Because this could, of course, change the course of current agreements and policies. So I might start with Tom, if that's okay.
Well, I seem to be the bearer of the negative in this meeting. So the only pushback against that, I mean, and it will be disastrous, I think, but the only pushback is that industry, wants to make a profit. They don't want to be left with stranded assets. So I'm sure that the greening of industry will carry on. It's just whether they can, overwhelm the Luddite element of America, which I'd like to be positive that that's the case. I know that in this country, I went to a conference at Olympia where there were lots of startups, renewable industry startups, and two politicians spoke. First, Claire Coutinho, who was the government environment minister, secretary of state, I think, and extraordinarily, she made a speech saying, this is before the election, she said, it's the primary strategy of the government is not to give investor confidence because that got in the way of innovation and competition. And then Ed Miliband of Labour, her shadow minister, came on and said, that's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. A primary move of a new Labour government would be to create investor confidence. And one hopes that that kind of, capitalist ethic will continue with industry in America if that happens. But, watch this space.
Jane, did you want to say anything further about the changes to global collaboration in relation to any of the elections that have recently happened or are going to happen?
Well, two things I think what Tom is saying brings to mind for me. Some people will know there's a really interesting podcast co-hosted by Christiana Figueres, which is called Outrage and Optimism, and they actually deal with the issue in an episode about 2 months ago about Trump getting elected. And what was very interesting is that senior officials in the current USA government thought exactly the point that Tom said, which is that the IRA has been so successful, particularly in the kind of Rust Belt states, in terms of actually creating jobs, that they don't believe that the industry will turn around at all because there aren't any real alternatives. So of course there will be, just as Rishi Sunak tried to create a kind of flurry of oil and gas drilling, some of which unfortunately we do have as a legacy following the Conservative government, but that actually that's not where the money is, that's not where the investment is. And I think the fact that America is sort of increasingly becoming an outlier on some of these issues for the rest of the world. I mean, it still calls itself leader of the free world, but it's not sort of behaving like a leader. It calls itself leader of the free world rather than people acknowledging that. So I think which leads on to my second point, which is that we've seen some real kind of right-wing pushes that have not ended in right-wing outcomes recently. I mean, France is still in sort of turmoil, but it saw off the kind of very right-wing approaches. The UK is in a very difficult place over this weekend because the English Defence League has kind of like done exactly what Tom was talking about, which is that is using lies to actually galvanize their supporters over the whole of the last week. And we've seen some really awful kind of like I call them the sort of men with no neck thugs who have been targeting asylum seekers and refugees, and luckily so far they have been seen off by the police mostly, but terrifying experiences. And in each case there have been more people who have been against the men with no necks. They are almost universally men and they are almost universally neckless, so it's there have been more people against them, but we've seen some pretty horrible kind of like outcomes and clashes. And the absolute test for democracy will be what the new government does about it, because they've allowed supporters of Just Stop Oil to be jailed for 5 years. So we would expect this kind of insurrection, etc., to be dealt with very harshly. But of course, all these people will go in front of magistrates' courts in the first instance, which don't have the power to enable sentences of that kind. But there's going to have to be a very, very clear government response that is greater for this activity than anything else. They're in meeting today. I'm sure we'll know the outcome tomorrow. And I think I can't remember what the proportion is, Tom, but I think we generally think we have about 83% right-wing press. in the UK. So we'll get a lot of commentary that might not be of the views shared on this call.
5 million.
Yeah.
5 million audience for the right-wing press, 250,000 for the Guardian. That's basically the proportion.
Yeah, and I think so. We do have to bear that in mind, but we also have to bear in mind that the number of people who get their news from these sources is smaller than it's ever been. So, which brings us hugely into the whole social media debate as well. But yeah, so I mean, I still feel that good people are triumphing at the moment. The hope, not hate. That is a very broad definition for me of good people in all the spheres. Good people are still triumphing, and we have to continue to find ways to help them do that.
Thank you, Jane. That's a lovely, hopeful message to kind of bring us almost to a conclusion. Nivek, did you want to weigh in on this? I can see there is also one more question for you. I'll see if perhaps you can weave this into your response or comments as well. The question is there something to show how the truth and freedom of information and consultative processes are encouraged so that the involvement for sustainable decision-making is responsibly informed and processed? And are there any educational implications in regards to this?
So in deliberative processes, there's so the deliberative processes fit within the democratic function of collective will formation. And the collective there is not just the people attending the citizens' jury who are members of that, but people beyond, both other citizens and experts. And so a well-run citizens' assembly would involve ensuring that the people participating as members of the jury actually know what other citizens think. They know what experts think. They're given access to, information. So, freedom of information applies there, so that they can actually make recommendations based on deliberation with the other people, but also based on knowledge and education. And so education is a key aspect of a citizens' assembly. One of the challenges, again, is that often governments don't have a lot of money when they're going to fund these things, and they're not prepared to put more in. And so they maybe run something over 2 or 3 days, and there's no way that people can actually realistically, nobody expects them to become experts, but they really can't understand the issues and the, challenges and opportunities, pros and cons and so on, of complex issues in a couple of days. So, it's another one of those challenges. As I say, I think citizens' juries can make a strong contribution. They could make a better contribution if they were designed differently and if they were designed robustly.
Thank you so much, Nivek. We've come to time, but before we leave, I just wanted to ask the panel if they had any last minute 30-second thoughts that they wanted to cap off with, perhaps starting with you, Tom, just a very final message.
Well, I'd like to end with a positive, and that is, I think that citizens' assemblies are key. So I agree with that. I think it's great calling them citizens' juries, because that would stop, if we had that in this country, that would stop the right-wing press saying that we wanted to tear down democracy, because of course a jury is part of democracy, and so that scuppers that argument. But I think citizens' assemblies are key. So
amazing. And Jane, a final comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're a key role in new deliberative democracy, and it's going to become more and more important in terms of keeping people engaged in their own positive futures, to engage more citizens in the ways in which governments need to respond. And I know that in terms of what we're going to publish in September, is there'll be pretty radical propositions, unless we get the people of Wales behind them, then they won't work. So I think that in terms of the action that's needed to be taken on climate and nature, then it's actually how we turn a moment into a movement. And I know that the Future Generations Commissioner, who's worth watching that space for people across the world, is actually working sort of with me and others, looking at the concept of a standing citizens' jury, for example, in Wales. We've had assemblies on narrow issues, but if we're going to how do we get it into the process so that any government and public services has a duty to listen to the outcomes, actually becomes much, much more important in this space. So, you know, I'd love to continue the conversation, Nivek, too.
Amazing. And Nivek?
So, yeah, look, I'm really pleased to hear what Jane said there, because I think whilst everything you've said, Jane, around what's happening in Wales sounds fantastic, one of the challenges often is trying to make decisions where you've got trade-offs to make. You can't do everything. And how do you know what the people would be prepared to accept in a trade-off? And often when people understand an issue, their judgment around what they would trade off is quite different to what politicians might think it is based on political polling and so on. And so that's where I think citizens' juries can play a really important role in terms of getting that understanding from a group of people who themselves now understand an issue. And it's not a sort of someone rings you at dinner time and asks you, you know, what do you think about this? It's a much more well-informed, thoughtful, and and deliberated. They've talked to other citizens about it. And you know, I was a public servant for many years, and I know how I used all the input from the community and experts. I sort of went in, you know, I sort of was like, what would the minister accept? What makes most sense here to me? And I had, you know, lots of hidden biases that I wasn't aware of. A deliberative mini public, a citizens' jury, replaces the public servant making all those value judgments and actually comes up with recommendations that are much more publicly available, much more, you know, not thinking about what the minister wants, thinking about what the people want. So, you know, I really think they add a lot of value to you know, other processes of democracy.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nivek. And thank you to all of our panel for all of your comments and insights today. It's been such an incredibly rich conversation. And of course, we've just scratched the surface of what is an incredibly complex topic.